welcome to this brand new edition of Global Lens on News 9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. As always, we have a packed show for you with all the top stories from around the globe. Let's get started with our big focus. Most have described it as a sham of an election. Others say it is a stage-managed poll designed to ensure Putin's fifth term in the Kremlin. Yet, it is an election that will be closely watched by the world. Russians are set to head to the polls for their country's presidential election with only one expected outcome. With Alexei Navalny dead under unexplained circumstances and opposition candidate Boris Nadezhdin barred from contesting, there is nobody to pose a serious obstacle to another 6 years of rule by Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin not only controls television in Russia, it also manages the entire political system, including elections. President Putin faces no serious challenge as he seeks a fifth term in office. His most vocal critics have either fled into exile or been jailed at home. Navalny, his fiercest opponent, is dead. But the Kremlin likes to boast that Russia has the best democracy in the world. So along with Putin on the ballot are three officially authorized challengers from Russia's Kremlin-friendly parliament. Most of the voting will take place in Russia and in the annexed regions of Ukraine over 3 days between the 15th and 17th of March, starting tomorrow, though some regions vote in advance. Russia is a huge country with 11 time zones and large expanses of sparsely populated and remote areas. It is so massive that the Election Commission uses helicopters to access remote areas in Siberia to stage pop-up voting stations. It's the first time multi-day voting is taking place in a Russian presidential election, as well as the first allowing voters to cast ballots online. In 2021, opposition groups had alleged that digital votes in Russia's parliamentary elections showed signs of manipulation. This time, the vast majority of independent Russian media outlets have been banned, and anyone found guilty of spreading what the government deems to be deliberately false information about the country's invasion of Ukraine can be imprisoned for up to 15 years. Presidential elections in Russia have followed a familiar pattern over the last 20 years or thereabouts. In the 2018 presidential vote, the Communist Party runner-up, Pavel Grudinin, secured 11.8% of the vote compared to Putin's 76.7%. At the time, there were allegations of forced voting and election violations, as footage released by a government opposition group appeared to show ballot boxes being stuffed. Putin previously won elections in 2012 with 64.35% of the vote, in 2004 with 71.91%, and in 2000 with 53.44% of the vote. Barred from seeking a third consecutive presidential term in 2008, Putin was appointed Prime Minister of Russia by the then President Dmitry Medvedev. The Russian president is elected by direct popular vote. If no candidate receives over 50% of the vote, then a second round is held between the two most popular candidates 3 weeks later. Previous years have seen television debates among some of those running for president. Putin has not been particularly busy on the campaign trail, given that his victory is assured. The frontrunner by miles, the 71-year-old incumbent has essentially been at the top of Russian politics since 1999. For Putin to run again after a quarter of a century in power, the Kremlin changed the Russian constitution. What that means is that Putin can now seek 2 more terms as president, going all the way up to 2036. He faces a trio of token contenders, none of whom have criticized him. They include Nikolai Kharitonov of the Communist Party, Leonid Slutsky of the Nationalist Liberal Democratic Party, and Vladislav Davankov of the New People Party. They broadly support the Kremlin and its policies, including the invasion of Ukraine. Previous elections have shown such candidates are unlikely to get enough votes to mount a real challenge to Putin. Now, Boris Nadezhdin is one of the highest profile anti-war figures remaining inside Russia following the death of Navalny. After running an efficient campaign to gain the signatures required to stand in the election, he was barred from running by the country's election commission. The 60-year-old leader has called for a halt to the war in Ukraine and urged Russia to start a dialogue with the West. Reports suggest that a rally is planned for the 18th of March to mark the 10th anniversary of Russia's annexation of Crimea. That is also likely to be seen as Putin's victory rally. Many commentators describe the Russian presidential election as a referendum on the war in Ukraine, and a vote for Putin will be seen as a vote for the war. It has become increasingly risky to protest against the government in Russia in recent years, with those taking to the streets often arrested and imprisoned. Shortly before his death, opposition leader Navalny called on voters to go to the polls and form long lines as a form of protest. In response, the Kremlin warned there would be legal consequences for anyone who heeded that call. Despite fears of arrest, tens of thousands of people gathered in Moscow for Navalny's funeral, with crowds chanting his name. Let's take a quick look at some of the most dramatic developments marked by bloodshed that have unfolded in Russia since its full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago. Russia's war has brought death and destruction to Ukraine. The Russian military has suffered huge losses as well. Russian towns have been shelled and come under drone attacks. Hundreds of thousands of Russian men were drafted into the army. Wagner mercenaries revolted against Putin and marched on Moscow. Their leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, later died in a plane crash. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Russia's president for alleged war crimes. Now, Vladimir Putin's most vocal critic is dead. If you ask the people on the street, many say what they foresee in the days ahead is even greater repression, with Russia evidently heading towards totalitarianism and full dictatorship. 2 years into the war, Putin sounds increasingly confident and determined to defeat his enemies at home and abroad. He rails against the United States, NATO and the European Union and presents Russia's war in Ukraine as a war on Russia by the collective West, an existential battle for the country's survival. Not to mention the nuclear threat that Putin routinely dangles. Just earlier this week, he reiterated that Russia was ready for a nuclear war. The question is, while the outcome of this election may be a foregone conclusion, what would it mean for Russia, for Ukraine, and for the world at large?
You are not only to cast your vote, but to firmly declare your will and aspiration, your personal involvement in Russia's further development, because the election is a step into the future. Let me be very clear. The participation in the election is the manifestation of patriotic sentiments. The residents of Donbass and Novorossiya are well aware of this, as they vote for the unification with Russia in the harshest conditions. And they will also make their choice in the coming days. All of us, the multinational people of Russia, are one big family. We do worry and care about our native country. We want it to be safe, strong, free and prosperous, to see living standards and the quality of life rising. And that is how it will be. We will do as we want. Therefore, I ask you to come to the election and manifest your civil and patriotic stance. Vote for a candidate of your choice.
So, what does this election mean for Russia, Ukraine, the West and the world at large? Let's throw this question to our guest. Joining me on Global Lens tonight is Adit Kothari, foreign affairs expert, joining us live from London. Ambassador Ashok Sajanhar, former Indian diplomat, joining us from Delhi. And completing the panel on Global Lens tonight is Professor Swaran Singh at the Centre for International Politics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Gentlemen, welcome to Global Lens. Adit Kothari, if I could start with you. Like I said, some have called it a sham of an election. Others say this is a stage-managed poll designed to ensure yet another 6-year term for Vladimir Putin. Many also say there is very little enthusiasm amongst the voters, given that the outcome is a foregone conclusion, But there are those who say that this election will still be seen as a referendum on the Ukraine war, and every vote cast in favor of Vladimir Putin will be seen as a vote in favor of the war itself, which has now dragged on for 2 years. The question I want to ask you is, how significant do you believe this election is likely to be for Russia's future and particularly for Ukraine? What likely impact could it have on the 2-year-old war?
Thanks for having me, Neha. So if we look at the trajectory of how Vladimir Putin has gone about his politics, he's essentially turned electoral politics into a science. It's the winnability for him, he doesn't let anybody come close to beating him, and that's what he's done. He's been there for over decades. He controls all of the opinion polls. He's got rid of all of the oppositions, like you essentially mentioned. And his government is keen on ensuring that as many people can turn out for this particular elections to essentially support him. So, last few elections, we've seen people being moved from one polling station to another on buses, sometimes even voting as much as 4 to 5 times. And that is what he's going to do. He's going to try and create an environment where he can generate enough support from an electoral mandate perspective that he can show internally and externally to gain his momentum on Russia. And from an external perspective, what he's trying to do is he's not trying to overpower the Western powers or the NATO in general. But what he's waiting for them to do is become weaker and more fractured. I mean, we've seen in France, for example, President Macron is no longer holding a majority in parliament. In the United Kingdom, for example, there is a lot of angst against Rishi Sunak for being involved in Ukraine, and that angst was also seen with regards to Boris Johnson when he initially made a lot of surprise visits to Ukraine. So essentially, he's just waiting for the West to essentially become fractured, more weaker, and so he can make his position more consolidated on Ukraine. So the Ukraine war is not getting over at this point. That's certainly not the case. But the only issue internally that he will want to mitigate before he decides to move in again is how does he manage the sort of feelings and the angst of those families of those Russian soldiers who are going to be moving into this particular war. Neha.
All right. Thanks, Adit, for your opening remarks. Let me now take this to Ambassador Sajanhar. Ambassador Sajanhar, as I mentioned, the Kremlin controls the media in Russia. It also manages the political system, including the elections. We know President Putin faces no serious challenge as he seeks a 5th term in office. His most vocal critics have either fled into exile or been jailed at home, or worse, are dead. The Kremlin still likes to boast that Russia has the best democracy in the world. Many would consider this to be a joke, of course. And there are 3 other people on the ballot who, interestingly, have been officially authorized by the Kremlin to be his challengers. However, the question I want to ask you is this. We all know Putin is going to be president for another 6 years at the very least. Yet, why do you think the world is watching this election so closely? Why is it significant? And what impact is it likely to have on Ukraine?
Yeah, I think, thank you very much, Neha. I think the world is watching this election very closely because, it, to an extent, it will give an idea, it'll, bring out in terms of, the result of the election is not in doubt. But it will bring out to an extent the amount of support that Putin enjoys. Meaning, of course, we have seen from the very many polls that have been conducted, and results of all these polls over the last 2 years seem to suggest that Putin enjoys huge popularity in the country. And even as far as the latest polls seem to suggest that 86% of the people, of the citizens of the country, support his special military operation in Ukraine. So I think in terms of the turnout, in terms of the numbers who come out, that will be an indication of sorts in terms of how the people are supportive of the operations that have been going on for the last more than 2 years in Ukraine. You see, because you are very right, as far as these three candidates are concerned, they are not opposed to the war. They are not opposed to Putin. In fact, right in your opening remarks, you did mention that Nadezhdin, who has been opposed to the Ukraine conflict, he was able to bring in the requisite number of signatures for his candidature to be taken forward, but then his candidature he was debarred from participating in elections. So there is no one really on the ballot who challenges the positions that Putin has taken as far as the war is concerned. So, in that context, there is nothing much to watch out what the others are getting. But there have been statements, there have been comments that people might, number one, not come out to vote in protest because the result of the election is very clear. So they don't want to sort of, even make that effort. Or they would, give a protest vote, something that Alexei Navalny had said that, you do smart voting in terms of identify the candidate. This he had mentioned, of course, in the provincial elections, that you identify a candidate who is most likely to stand against the policies of Putin. In this case, of course, there is none of that nature, but there could be different ways of registering their protest. So I think that might give some sort of an idea as to how much Putin is in control of the situation. But I think, as you have said very rightly, Neha, it is the result is a foregone conclusion, and which will further strengthen Putin's hand, and he will continue with whatever he has been doing as far as the operations in Ukraine are concerned. He will continue to sort of flex the nuclear muscle also, although I don't think there is any cause whatsoever for him to do that, because right at the beginning, maybe when the first counteroffensive by Ukraine had taken place, then there might have been some cause, and he had said, that if there is an existential threat as far as Russia is concerned, then it will not hesitate to use the nuclear option. But as far as the situation now is concerned, he's in control of 20% of the territory of Ukraine. He has occupied these four provinces, Luhansk, Donetsk, in addition to Crimea in 2014, and Zaporizhia and Kharkiv. So I think there is no real threat or danger to Russia as such, but still he continues to brandish this nuclear weapon. So I think, as we've been speaking, the results are known. So his policies with respect to Ukraine are likely to be what they have been, and he's in no hurry. He had expected that the West will wilt and come to its knees maybe by the first winter, because if there is oil and gas from Russia, it is not flowing into the Western European countries, then they will not be able to withstand the impact of the first winter. But now it is more than 2 years, and while there might be fissures and dissensions in various countries, but still they are there, they are standing strong, they are there to support Ukraine. But he will continue with this war of attrition, not only against Ukraine, but also against the support that Ukraine has been receiving from Europe and from...
Quite right. I mean, this war has gone on for longer than I think anyone had expected, especially given Putin's own statement. At the time when he launched the so-called special military operations, he had said he expected it to wrap up within 15 days, and more than 2 years later, here we are. But clearly, both sides are digging in their heels. Nobody's willing to budge. And, you know, it's also interesting, Ambassador Sajanha referred to those areas, those territories in Ukraine that Russia has annexed. Interestingly, Putin is appealing to voters in the annexed parts of Ukraine to also cast their ballot in this election. And on the 18th of March, he is expected to hold a rally to mark 10 years of the annexation of Crimea. And many believe that will also double up as his victory rally. Okay, let me take this to Professor Swaran Singh. Professor Swaran Singh, you know, of course, we know that President Putin loves to dangle the nuclear threat before the West every few weeks. Just earlier this week, he said, of course, Russia is ready for a nuclear war with the West. Now, many believe that another term in office is only going to embolden President Putin further, who is absolutely in no hurry to end this war. But given that there is not a single individual on the ballot who is opposed to this war, can we really say that this war, I beg your pardon, that this election could be a referendum on the Ukraine war in any way? Do you see a significant protest vote being cast here?
Neha, first of all, let me say that this year, 2024, is extremely interesting and historic, particularly for elections.
Absolutely.
So for discipline of psychology, which is study of elections, estimates are between 40 to 70 nations might experience elections in this year. And the big ones, of course, will be India and United States and Russia that we are discussing now. I think first thing to underline is that despite enormous control that President Putin has, and we are all saying that the outcome of elections is known beforehand to all of us, the support has been so far between 67 to 75% of votes in favor of President Putin or Prime Minister Putin earlier. So there has been a certain sort of indication of not acceptance of him as a candidate by a certain category of voters. Now, what makes it interesting, as you mentioned, this is happening in middle of 2 years of Ukraine war. And that is going to be an overarching influence in that sense as to how that influences the voters. And supposing the vote share, you know, we can imagine going down 50% for President Putin, according to constitution, then there will be a second round of election, which again will have enormous implications for his leadership in that sense. So there is already not 100%, 90% support, but 60, 70% support. This could potentially change. And I think therefore, that's my third point, therefore President Putin's primary focus has been to not allow candidates who are opposing his war in Ukraine to be contestants, because that could kind of give rise to this anti-war sentiment. So he's made sure that both candidates, Boris Nadezhdin and of course another TV journalist, Yekaterina Dontsova, who were apparently openly against the war, have been disqualified on very simple technical grounds of signatures and so on. And there are few candidates still in the fray to just make it look like a contested election rather than unopposed elections in that sense. But yes, there are going to be serious challenges for President Putin in actually winning that election, and particularly in Crimea, in eastern Ukraine, in Luhansk and Donetsk. How voters behave is going to be carefully watched by several people around the world. We are hearing that already there are law and order related violence happening in eastern Ukraine now.
Okay.
And how that is going to influence the outcomes. Voters are also going to be this time unusually impacted upon not just only Ukraine war, but also very closely related brandishing of nuclear weapons.
Yes.
Indicating that Russia could restart nuclear testing. The whole foreign policy isolation that Russia is facing in terms of impact on energy exports and overall trade and economy. So voters are going to be really impacted upon with series of these things in how they cast that vote.
Okay.
And how they kind of reflect whether they are seeing an increasing amount of dissension being more visible than sort of support being visible.
Yes.
And of course, we are all saying that he could actually have an endorsement to stay for 2 more terms, and that would make him.
He goes on till 2036 in that case,
Yeah,
and I don't
that-
think
that
that will
would-
surprise anyone at all. Okay.
It would make him.
Okay. Okay. I'm so sorry. We'll have to cut short this discussion because there's some big breaking news coming in on electoral bonds. But I would like to thank Adit Kutari, Ambassador Sajjanahar, Professor Swaran Singh for joining me to decode the Russian presidential election. That's all the time we have on Global Lens tonight. Thanks so much for watching.
There's a new video around what deepfake can do.
We had seen a trailer of this a few days back.